Chapter 1. Making the First Steps in Tennis. Rome wasn't built in a day. We all have to start somewhere. Even multiple Grand Slam champions began in their local club, playing thoroughly unimpressive tennis. Some have more natural talent than others, but with practice, anyone can become competent. However, you should also bear in mind that the game of tennis is very difficult, and you will almost certainly find it extremely tricky at first. Most people that take their first steps onto a tennis court struggle to hit the ball over the net and in the court at first, which is why it is often asserted that you should begin at a very young age if you have any intention of playing seriously. There aren't too many examples of professional players who didn't begin at a tender age, that's for sure. Another thing that shouldn't discourage you as you make your first steps in tennis is your level of natural ability. I personally ended up playing tennis seriously as it was discovered at school that I had an unusual level of natural talent. I could actually rally the ball back and forth with my teacher as many times as everyone else in the class put together. But although I may have had a head start on others, I also believe that it is easily possible for absolutely anyone to reach the level that I was at in those early days, and reasonably quickly. The most important thing to remember as you embark on your tennis playing journey is that the game is ultimately supposed to be fun. In common with the most competitive endeavors, it is often taken extremely seriously. But ultimately, you shouldn't forget that you are only engaging in a bat and ball game. Try to enjoy your time on the court, particularly when you're just beginning, and take something positive out of every experience, regardless of whether you win or lose. This chapter will encompass the following: selecting appropriate equipment, selecting the best racket for your age and ability, what age you should start playing at, basic grips, etc., what tennis activity you should be involved in when you first start, how to choose the best tennis equipment. There's no doubt that your racket is the most important aspect of tennis equipment, but we will briefly begin by discussing other aspects of your kit. Firstly, specialist tennis shoes are available for various court conditions, and it is certainly worth considering these if you have a suitable budget. However, a good all-purpose tennis shoe will suffice for all surfaces. It is also worth considering that clay courts are particularly hard on shoes, and this can be a concern for parents in particular. It is also debatable whether clay is the ideal surface to develop as a young player, as it can encourage attritional play. Having said that, modern tennis is undoubtedly dominated by baseline play, and clay arguably provides the ideal opportunity to mold consistency in this department, while also aiding the development of stamina. Nonetheless, unless you are resident in a European country in which clay courts are de rigueur, it probably is sensible to begin playing on hard courts. These require less specialist shoes than either grass or clay, and not as hard-wearing as clay in particular, and are available all year round. Tennis clothing shouldn't be too tight, but loose-fitting garments have become rather unfashionable recently. In all honesty, it really makes little difference to how you play, and children can afford to wear larger clothing that will last them longer. More important are the balls that you play with initially. While there is always a tendency to mimic the professionals, it is probably more advisable for young players to get their hands on the fastest balls available. Different balls from varying manufacturers do feature differing air pressure, and this affects the speed with which they travel through the court. Young players will be encouraged by the higher pressure balls, as they will initially find it difficult to get the ball through the court with any pace. However, the racket that you use is obviously the most important item of tennis equipment. Selecting this is really dependent on age and ability. But let's start at the start. When beginning your tennis playing journey, it is important to select a racket with a sizable sweet spot. There are plenty of rackets available that effectively do the work for you, meaning that when you do strike the ball in the middle of the strings, you will attain power more easily. Getting the racket head size right for younger players can be a balancing act. It is certainly not advisable for a younger player to use the size of a racket that is utilized by the world's best ever player. Roger Federer uses a Wilson staff with a tiny racket head, although his previous equipment featured an even smaller head than this. On the other hand, although there are rackets available with huge racket heads, younger players may find these too heavy and ultimately unwieldy. Don't underestimate the danger of causing physical discomfort with a tennis racket. There is a reason that the complaint tennis elbow exists. Indeed, this condition is a serious risk with heavier rackets, while the lightest equipment on the market will force players to use their wrists a great deal and ultimately place a huge amount of strain on them. To illustrate this problem, I recently played with Federer's racket for the first time, having been more accustomed to heavier rackets with larger sweet spots. While the Federer Pro Staff enables a huge amount of control and feel, I knew within 20 minutes of using it for the first time that it wasn't for me. Indeed, by the end of the 2-hour session, my wrist was barely able to move. So be very careful when selecting a racket for a child, as the developing body will struggle if their racket is not sufficiently powerful. Nonetheless, I wouldn't recommend a racket that weighs over 300 grams for younger players, as it will simply be too heavy. A shorter grip is also recommended for beginners, with 4 1/8 or 4 2/8 advisable. Oh, and definitely don't forget a tension dampener. They are widely available for next to nothing and will make playing the game considerably less stressful on your wrists. Finally, there are now many junior tennis rackets available on the market. I personally never used one of these, but then I didn't begin playing tennis on a full-sized court till age 8. Many younger players graduate to lawn tennis at a significantly more tender age than this, and for these individuals, it is certainly sensible to utilize these stumpier rackets. What age should you start playing tennis? However, I question the wisdom of playing on a full-size tennis court with adult equipment at the age of 3 or 4. While many great players begin very young, they didn't necessarily play in adult conditions for several years. I myself began by playing short tennis with a plastic racket and sponge ball, and I feel this is a much better way to learn the basic techniques and tactics of the game. Short tennis is now often referred to as mini tennis, and I definitely believe that this is the best place for youngsters to start. It will be rather discouraging for young children to play on a full-size court at a preschool age, and mini tennis enables players to gain a degree of proficiency in a short period of time. Striking the sponge ball is considerably easier than dealing with a proper tennis ball, and the dimensions of a mini tennis court certainly suits the developing body. Another valuable and enjoyable aspect of your early tennis career is the opportunity to play lots of mixed tennis with girls and boys. Until the age of approximately 10, there is little difference in tennis playing proficiency between boys and girls, with the best players of both genders playing at roughly similar levels. At around this age, Serena Williams infamously beat Andy Roddick, and I remember playing close matches with top female players when I was younger. This means that the younger players can participate in mixed and social tennis, which will benefit their development as a person as well as their tennis skills. This can also be a useful precursor to participating in mixed doubles and other social events later in a tennis career. Speaking of doubles, I would strongly advise very young players to participate in this variant of tennis, as well as singles. In fact, it is debatable whether young players should really be playing competitively at all, and certainly not in tournaments. I played in my first short tennis tournament when I was 7 years old, And I think any competitive action at a younger age than this is counterproductive and unnecessary. Learning the basic techniques of the game and having fun should certainly be the priority at first. It can be difficult to quell the natural competitiveness of some youngsters, and I know that I always greatly relish competition from a young age. But keeping them away from tournaments for a few years at least will be beneficial, as it will prevent them from being discouraged by losing to superior players. I was fortunate to have some natural talent and reached the national short tennis finals just 6 months after picking up a racket for the first time. But this won't be the journey for all players, and any boy or girl's ultimate success in the game will certainly not be predicated on these very early gambits. But doubles should be considered a vital part of any player's tennis education. Spending time at the net will lead to a more rounded technique, and this will stand any player in good stead for their later career. Net play is arguably less important now than it was in the past, but anyone who develops volleying skills will have a useful string in their bow, while doubles is also a key aspect of social tennis and another option in the professional game. At the age of 41, as I am writing this, I have stopped playing singles almost entirely because it's just more fun to play doubles. I'm sure singles will become even less fun in the years to come. Thus, if you intend to spend your life participating in the sport, it is better to become accustomed to doubles at an early age. The most important basic techniques. There is not going to be a huge amount of material in this book regarding how to hit a tennis ball, although I will go over all the basic techniques and the strokes and techniques that you need to learn as you get better. But I don't want to devote vast amounts of material to technical issues. There are 3 reasons for this. First, the information is already widely available. Secondly, this is an area of the sport that will be conveyed by coaches and will be based partly on observation of the individual player's technique. Thirdly, the only way to learn how to hit a tennis ball is to practice your shots over and over and over again. While some players will exhibit natural talent, the ground strokes, serve, volleys, and overheads absolutely cannot be developed without continual repetition over several years. While the basic techniques can be communicated to young players, it is almost impossible to truly teach someone how to hit a tennis ball. There is so much feel involved in this, and this can really only be developed over thousands and thousands and thousands of strikes. Ultimately, there is no right or wrong way to play tennis, and thus it is difficult to give blanket advice with regard to the actual strokes. However, some basic principles can be finalized, along with the racket grips available. We will look at some more advanced techniques in the next chapter. Serving begins with the ball toss. This is really the central aspect of the service motion. Even if you are the world's greatest server, you won't hit your service well if you don't get the ball toss right. Indeed, you will often notice that professional players who are struggling with their service motions or just generally nervous will repeatedly get their ball toss wrong. Laura Robeson would be a good example. Thus, practicing the ball toss on a regular basis is particularly valuable, especially when you're starting out as a tennis player. The ball toss should be slightly out in front of you for most services, although it needs to be behind you for the kick serve. We will deal with the technique for this aspect of the game later in the book. One thing that you should always be thinking when you serve is to reach the racket head as high as possible. This gives you increased height to get the ball over the net and downwards into the service box, and also potentially as leverage. Similarly, you should ideally jump up slightly in the air to meet your ball task as you serve, or at least begin by getting on your tiptoes. Every inch counts when delivering the service. An interesting strategy with the service is to move around the baseline when you are delivering the serve. You can actually make the down the tee serve so much easier by standing right next to the center line. And if you do this surreptitiously, then you can catch your opponent so that they don't even notice your altered service position. Similarly, it is valuable to learn how to hit a wide variety of different surfaces from the same ball toss. Roger Federer is a notorious master of this facet of the game. There are sliders, sliced services, power serves, wide serves, centrally positioned serves, and body serves to learn, and if you can hit as many of these with the same motion and ball toss as possible, it will hide your intention from the opponent, making it far more difficult to return your serve. With ground strokes, the absolute key to hitting them effectively is to take your racket back as early as possible. This is an important part of the preparation, and it is good to drill yourself in this technique from as early in your tennis career as possible, as it will become essential when people start hitting the ball hard at you. You should certainly have taken your racket right back by the time that the ball arrives in your half of the court, at least for an ordinary ground stroke. If you are chasing down a drop shot down, this obviously doesn't apply. Another key movement with ground strokes is to begin low and finish high. It is also important to move your legs, and especially knees, properly. You should be bending down to meet lower bouncing balls, otherwise you will never hit them properly. It is also important to get into the right position to hit the tennis ball, and that means never getting too close to the ball. Many shots that are not executed correctly, even in the professional game, come about due to the player either being too close or too far away from the ball. Obviously, this position should be roughly a racket length away from the ball, but the only way to learn this is perpetual practice. Finally, the follow-through is incredibly important in all tennis strokes, but particularly the ground strokes. You shouldn't poke or prod at the ball. You should hit it right through each ball and swing the racket thoroughly after making contact. You will see that with top-class players that their follow-through is as important and probably even longer than their backlift. Watch the way that Rafael Nadal unwinds his racket, for example. When volleying, you should take a much shorter swing at the ball, often described as punching. The exception to this is when you're taking the ball out of the air from deeper in the court with a drive volley, which involves taking the ball from below the height of the net and effectively hitting a ground stroke type shot with topspin. For drive volleys, you must hit through the ball with significant whip. Otherwise, you will end up hitting it miles out of court. But for standard volleys, you don't really need to hit the ball too hard, and the stroke should be based around a short, punchy motion. It is also really important to steer the ball by manipulating the racket head when volleying, as you will be a sitting duck within a few strokes if you don't finish the point while at the net. Finally, the smash or overhead is the most dramatic shot in the game, and probably the most satisfying when executed correctly. The first thing I would say about the smash is that you should always be willing to let the ball drop. It is more satisfying taking it out of the air, and this can also be the right shot. But take into account the trajectory of the ball and your court position, and quite frequently, you might find that you can deliver a powerful overhead and accurate overhead without taking the ball out of the air. Secondly, don't overhit when hitting a smash. If you catch the ball decently, you will almost always win the point with an overhead. Always keep an eye on the court position of your opponent, and this can lead to an easy put away. Finally, it is important to hit smashes and overhead shots in a downward trajectory, as if you power the ball from this position and fail to do so, the ball will almost without exception go beyond the baseline. Gripping the racket. So, finally, I want to look at the grips you should be using for the various strokes. There are a huge amount available with names such as Continental, Chopper, Hammer, Eastern, Western, and Semi-Western, all bamboozling the beginner. Each of these grips has advantages and disadvantages, but I want to look at the grips that I advocate rather than the other grips and explain the reasons for this. For the forehand, the semi-Western grip has become probably the most popular approach in tennis. This is because it enables players to hit with significant amounts of topspin while also not being too extreme in nature. The first point is going to be extremely important as your game develops, and I'm a big advocate of doing the right thing with your tennis from day one, rather than trying to make the game easy for beginners. For the semi-Western grip, you should look to grip the racket as close to the base as possible. This allows maximum leverage and power. If you hold a tennis racket for the first time, you may notice that the handle is split into 8 equal sections. The semi-Western grip involves placing the palm side of your index finger's knuckle against the bottom right section, if you're right-handed, and the bottom left section if you are left-handed. With the Western grip, which also has its advocates, the hand is effectively underneath the racket handle, which can be particularly uncomfortable and difficult for beginners. It also makes the transition into other strokes more fiddly. This is a big reason why the semi-Western grip should be utilized, although switching to volleying with this approach can still be a little tricky. The semi-Western grip results in the racket face pointing toward the ground, meaning that it is easier to brush up and over the ball to produce topspin. This is absolutely essential if you have any pretensions whatsoever of becoming a decent tennis player. You really won't go anywhere in the game by hitting the ball flat, although tennis can still be a fun sport to participate in, even if you're doing everything fundamentally wrong. Although learning to hit with topspin takes a bit of time and effort, I would argue that it even makes the game more fun for rookie players as it increases your margins of error, ultimately making the game a lot less frustrating. It's also too easy to hit the ball out of the back of the court when hitting without spin, whereas topspin makes the ball dip into the court before the baseline. For the service, yes, you're going to have to learn another grip. The serve requires a specialist grip, referred to as the continental grip, which enables you to hit with the variety that you will require for the stroke that starts every rally. The continental grip also makes it easier to flex your wrist at the point of impact, which will have a big impact on your service games. In order to form the continental grip, it is simply necessary to effectively shake hands with the racket, hence the fact that the continental grip is so often described as the shake hands grip. You should also volley using this grip, and it will furthermore provide the foundation for your backhand grip as well. I'm not going to discuss the grip and technique for a one-handed backhand in this book, as I strongly advocate using two hands on the racket. I love watching players with a one-handed backhand, particularly Roger Federer, but I firmly believe that it is simply more practical and consistent to hit with two hands. When forming the two-handed grip for the backhand, you should begin with your stronger hand in the continental forehand grip. Then also utilize the same grip with your second hand, which is naturally placed above your stronger hand on the racket handle. Your hand should be closely positioned against one another without overlapping. And finally, when executing any tennis grip, it is important to keep your eyes trained on the ball at all times. Remember Forrest Gump playing ping pong. So that's all of the basics converted that you need to play a proficient game of tennis. I should note that many coaches will advocate using similar grips and techniques when first learning the game, and there is nothing wrong with this whatsoever. But if you're going to be a proficient player, then you will need to use more sophisticated grips sooner or later. So I am a big advocate of making this sooner rather than later. In the next chapter, we will look at more advanced tennis techniques.